Okay, cool. So thank you everyone for this wonderful debate. This is a debate where all teams had lots of material, so I might miss some like tiny threads, but I should be able to cover all the main things that are like the main reasons for the deliberation. But everything was considered. If you think that I missed anything, feel free to DM me or like ask me afterwards. So I'm going to start with a call. We gave the first to opening opposition, the second to opening government, the third to closing government, and fourth, unfortunately, to closing opposition. I'm going to go through the debate chronologically. Firstly, on the top half. Firstly, the opening government brings two main pushes. One, the idea that if you have rich people living in amongst like the community as opposed to separated from the community, they are more likely to advocate for the general benefits of the people along with the population. This is because, one, they feel the same harms that the poor people are feeling in the community, and secondly, because of contact theory, you are more aware of their needs, or you are more aware of the problems and you want them solved. The second push from opening government is that it is more economically efficient in that it saves resources, in that you save land and you save extra resources used to build separate utilities. How does this compare to opening opposition? Firstly, opening opposition offers several responses to the advocacy point. One, they say that the direct response of the rich people feeling the harms of those poor people is not necessarily advocating to the government. Instead, it's likely that they just do private things to prevent these harms, such as improving private security and also doing things that benefit themselves rather than like the community at large. But secondly, even if they do lobby for things, it might not necessarily be along the people, but it might be things like over-policing, criminalizing homelessness, which actually aggravates the harm instead of benefiting the harm. I think this significantly mitigates the effect to which we can believe that the advocacy brought by those rich people are actually going to manifest, or whether they are actually going to bring significant benefit. So this is a very effective response. The second thing that opening opposition did is bring out the idea of brain drain and loss of investment. So firstly, on brain drain, opening opposition tells us that firstly, you just feel a lot less safe if you do not have that private security, because the gated community is the most effective way to prevent crime or like preemptively prevent these scary things from happening to you. Which is say, in the absence of this, there will be people that feel afraid and want to move away, either to other rich cities inside your country or to other countries. There's a lot likely to be like rich upper middle class people who have the ability to move away. I think opening government mitigates this to some extent by saying that, hey, it is actually cheaper for you to just lobby along with the people, and instead of you moving away, because it takes lots of money, you still have different kinds of ties in the around the area. Now, I don't think this mitigation will successfully completely take down the brain drain point, because the idea that you can just lobby instead of moving is reliant on the fact of those lobbying succeeding. And as mentioned in the opening government speech, like even though there is a greater chance of the advocacy working, it does not work all the time. So I am not able to think that they will just lobby all the time and stay here all the time. So there is still a non-insignificant amount of brain drain that happens. Another push from opening opposition will then be a reduce of investment from overseas, because those corporations that come in now fear that they don't want like their foreign expatriate workers or like their workers in general to be in an unsafe position. Therefore, they're reluctant to set up corporations in those places. They set up in other places, which means that they lose this stream of investment and lose this revenue of tax, which means that there is significant economic harms and job loss to the local people in general. Weighing this to the points from opening government still has some amount of advocacy that might still happen, and also some amount of resources that is saved by not using utilities, etc. However, we found that like as a panel, the potential harm that is caused by brain drain and lack of investment more directly harms the poor people, in that it takes them job away, and it is also a larger scale of harm. Therefore, in the end, we gave the top half to opening opposition. Bringing it in closing government. Firstly, there is this framing that says, hey, rich people are not all powerful. Most of the national policies are determined by populist leaders and like public democratic elections. Firstly, I want to talk about how this interacts with opening government. Because opening government's case is that the rich people is going to advocate for those particular things and get those good policy, right? So this is closing government's attempt to weigh against opening government and to mitigate the extent that opening government reaches this harm. Firstly, I want to note that opening government mechanisms does not actually predicate on rich people being all powerful and all controlling of the national policies. I think opening government's point is that in the local level they will advocate along with the local activists for the poor people, or not be as antagonistic to those local protests, etc. So I don't think this is necessarily able to mitigate it to such a great extent. But secondly, as per BP rules, I just cannot let this framing completely negate all the benefits of opening government. I still have to buy that. To some extent, the rich people still have some kinds of influence, and probably a disproportionately high influence compared to the average people, in order for this to not constitute a knifing. So therefore, in the end, after this framing, I still buy from opening government that they increase the likelihood of these good policies that benefit the poor people happening. And then, the main case from closing government is the idea that you get less irrational emotive elections. The mechanism is that when people see these gated communities, it is a very stark visual distinction between the having a public space being cornered for people, and there's colonial ties with it as well, which gets the people to disproportionately vote for populist policies, which are not necessarily good policies that benefit the country. How does this weigh against opening government? So when weighing this argument, there are two questions the panel asks. One, whether this irrational voting is significantly worse than the counterfactual. So whether people seeing this gated community thing, this one particular imagery, necessarily makes the election results much more rigged, much more irrational, to the extent where it brings significantly worse policies and yield those harms. The second question the panel asked is whether this policy is actually harmful. Because although closing government gave an example of a particular high tax rate policy in Chile and this causing brain drain, etc., the real structural link as to why this policy is harmful is just that people will vote irrationally and people will vote emotively. I don't think this is as direct a link as to why the policy will be bad as compared to opening government, which directly states that if the rich people feel the same harms of the poor people, they will directly lobby against those harms that the poor people are suffering. Therefore, I believe that opening government has a more certain link to actually bring those policies about that benefit poor people, whereas closing government relies on whether this policy is irrational or not, which I'm unsure whether this directly benefits or harms poor people, etc. As a result, we buy that the advocacy mechanisms from opening government is a more certain way for them to reach the beneficial policies as opposed to closing government mechanisms, which is why closing government places below opening government. Weighing against opening opposition is quite similar, because we are not very sure whether those policies are actually going to be harmful and whether this is substantially worse than the counterfactual, as pointed out by a POI from the opening opposition. This is not able to lead us to believe that you create such huge level kind of national harm that can weigh over the brain draining investment in opening opposition. Therefore, closing government places below the whole top half. Cool. Bringing in closing opposition. The first thing we have from closing opposition is the idea that rich people advocating is going to lead to them creating very bad policies in this neighborhood, such as things like over-policing, such as, let me check, because there are some of the mechanisms and some of the results were already stated in opening opposition. Just check the particular one that is new. So, for example, more cracking down on large-scale arrest, and also taking away public transport potentially, although this is not super clearly proven. Basically, this first push is that the rich people are going to create bad policies if they advocate along with the poor people. Firstly, clashing this with closing government. Closing government has a framing that says, look, rich people are not necessarily all powerful. So even if those rich people are in those community and they advocate for some bad things, they're not able to completely change the things into the bad things. I think this is able to mitigate closing opposition's claim, because closing opposition's claim is particularly rich people creating policies that are against the poor people's will, and then the poor people is really angry about this, right? So this is the reputation of closing opposition to closing government. However, this means that you rely on rich people going against the poor people, which according to closing government's very plausible framing that rich people cannot completely control the results because of elections, you are not able to actually show to me that the rich people are actually able to reach those policies. Therefore, relative to closing government, I'm not able to credit the idea that the rich people is able to completely change the policies into very terrible things. Now, that is different from opening government, because opening government is rich people going along with poor people, with closing opposition is rich people going against the poor people. Then, the second thing from closing opposition is some extension in terms of investment relative to opening opposition. Because opening opposition already covered a lot of mechanisms of why the perception of this place being unsafe is going to make the companies go away. What are the particular new things that were created from closing opposition? One is that you need the expertise of these people. So this is an additional impact instead of just creating jobs and creating more taxes. But secondly, is the idea that you necessarily need this gated community because otherwise the foreigners will feel alone. Firstly, I want to talk about how much our panel credited this amount of new extension, because a large part of the arguments that's put out by the closing opposition has already been mentioned by the opening opposition. So to the extent where closing opposition's new materials is particularly on the expertise and on those some foreigners who will feel afraid and alone if they do not have this gated community, I think the extended impact is quite limited, and whether this is actually sufficient to weigh over closing government. Weighing this against closing government, then, we buy that closing government still has some good plausibility that this is going to adversely influence the quality of policy on a nationwide level, which leads to worse outcomes for everyone, economically and like in terms of livelihood and like everything, right? Therefore, on a scale of impact, this is weighed by the government whip as well. This is has a greater impact, scale of impact, even though it is a bit more speculative relative to the brain drain argument. Therefore, we're still able to very narrowly place closing government over the closing opposition, because we found that this scale of impact is greater extent than the particular new bits of information from closing opposition. And then comparing closing opposition to opening opposition, I think, as explained, the new particular material in terms of you need more expertise and you need foreigners to not feel alone was not weighed comparing to opening opposition's arguments about why the perception of the city being safe is so important, why the ability to access very ready and easy security is the most important thing. The panelists has agreed that relatively these things feel a bit marginal, therefore is unable to take over opening opposition. Weighing closing opposition to opening government, then we buy that opening governments the rich people advocating in those poor areas is likely to lead to better policies and better likelihood of poor people getting things like welfare, getting things like increased policing in a good way. And then I am unable to put closing oppositions above opening government given the reasons I've mentioned above, but I would stress that a lot of closing oppositions cases were very close and could potentially take over the other if they had a bit more weighing or like a bit more new material. So that was how the panel viewed the debate. Feel free to approach us for feedback or any questions. I'm going to stop the recording.